A bold plan to attack the United States was conceived, but it came too late in the war for Japan to act on it. After Colonel James Doolittle's B-25 raid struck Japan in April 1942, the Japanese attempted to retaliate. However, by 1944, American air raids over Japan had become routine. It wasn't until early 1945 that the Imperial Japanese Navy was in a position to strike America even more aggressively than on December 7, 1941. After assessing potential targets, Japanese leaders decided against attacking cities like New York, San Francisco, San Diego, and Washington, D.C. Instead, they focused on the Panama Canal, a critical link for moving U.S. military supplies between the Atlantic and Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, came up with the idea to disable the canal. His plan involved specially designed aircraft launched from giant submarines that could bomb targets from the air. These submarines, known as the I-400 class, were the largest ever built at the time and would remain unmatched for years. Originally termed Senkin, or secret attack submarines, the name was later shortened to Santoku. In mid-1942, Yamamoto predicted that Japan would suffer from American air raids and believed Japan could respond by striking American territory. His concept involved building 18 massive submarine aircraft carriers that could each carry 3 bomber planes. Construction of these submarines began shortly after Yamamoto was killed by American P-38 fighters over the Solomon Islands. On April 25, 1943, work started on the first vessel. Without Yamamoto's leadership, the project lacked strong support, and Japan's war prospects deteriorated. Delays plagued the effort from the beginning. The first prototype, built at the Kure Navy Yard, entered service on December 30, 1944. 2 more, the I-401 and I-402, began construction at the Sasebo Navy Yard in Nagasaki. Though these shipyards were targeted by U.S. bombers, the scale of the submarines being built remained a secret. The I-401 became operational on January 8, 1945, and the I-402 followed on July 24. Once ready, the submarines were to form a unit known as Submarine Division 1. However, by the time the war ended in August 1945, only 3 of the 18 planned submarines had been completed. The I-403 to I-417 were never started, and 2 smaller subs, the I-13 and I-14, were built with similar goals. These enormous submarines were unlike anything any other Navy had built, and were 60% larger than any U.S. submarine until the nuclear era. Their most important feature was the aircraft hidden inside pressurized forward hangars. Japan had already developed the idea of using submarines to launch scout planes. The I-400 class submarines measured 400 feet in length with a draft of 23 feet and a beam of 39 feet. They featured a double hull design that the Soviet Union would later imitate. Powered by 2 electric motors and 4 diesel engines, the subs could displace 6,560 tons submerged and 5,223 tons on the surface. They had retractable snorkels to ventilate diesel fumes and bring in fresh air while submerged. Their range was an impressive 37,500 miles without refueling. On the surface, they could reach speeds up to 18 knots and about 6 knots when submerged. The submarines could dive up to 330 feet and carried crews of 140 to 220 sailors. Crew members had the rare luxury of a walk-in freezer for food storage, but otherwise faced harsh conditions, with only 1 restroom and limited fresh water. The I-400s were heavily armed. They had 8 forward-facing torpedo tubes for launching Type 95 torpedoes, 1 25mm single-barrel anti-aircraft gun, 3 25mm triple-barrel guns, and a 140mm deck gun. An unusual feature was a large slide used to clear the deck quickly during emergency dives. Crew members would jump into a funnel slide leading to a padded landing area, saving precious seconds. The subs looked unusual from the front due to their offset conning towers, a design choice that allowed space for the aircraft hangar. The hangar was 115 feet long and 12 feet wide, specially built by the Aichi Company to house the 3 float planes. Next to the hangar was an 80-foot pneumatic catapult used to launch the planes. The aircraft, called M6A1 Siren, were designed in 1942 by Aichi and required a 2-person crew, a pilot and a rear-facing gunner armed with a 12.7mm machine gun. The plane's wings and tail folded along the fuselage to fit in the hangar. Instead of wheels, the Siren had detachable floats. Its payload could include 2 551-pound bombs, a single 1,764-pound bomb, or one 1,874-pound bomb. The plane could fly about 642 nautical miles, or 739 standard miles. To speed up launch operations, parts of the aircraft were painted with fluorescent coatings, allowing the deck crew to work in minimal lighting. A 4-man crew could launch all 3 planes in about 45 minutes. By July 1945, only 28 Siren aircraft had been produced, 16 short of the goal, due to repeated delays. The continental United States was the ultimate target for these submarines and aircraft. Several potential targets were discussed, including cities on the West Coast and possibly even Washington, D.C. Bombing the Panama Canal was also considered. However, before any attacks could be carried out, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa clarified the primary goal of the I-400 class subs. The plan was called Operation PX and was inspired by the activities of Japan's notorious Unit 731. Once Japan occupied parts of Asia, Unit 731 established a large research facility in Harbin, Manchuria, under the cover of a water purification plant. There, they conducted horrifying experiments on thousands of civilians and prisoners of war, developing biological weapons. In early 1945, Japan was determined to strike the U.S. homeland. Ozawa wanted 4 submarines, the I-400, I-401, I-13, and I-14, to sail toward the U.S. West Coast and prepare for action. They devised a chilling plan involving the use of ceramic canister bombs that would be packed with fleas infected by deadly diseases like cholera, typhus, and plague. These biological weapons were intended to be dropped over major American cities, spreading illness and death to destabilize the country from within. The selected target for this grim operation was San Diego, California, and the idea stemmed from Japan's earlier biological warfare efforts in China, which had proven disturbingly effective. At the same time, Japan was preparing a second major operation aimed at sabotaging the Panama Canal. 2 very different individuals played a role in this plan. One was a Japanese man who had previously worked on the canal. He willingly handed over extensive documentation, including notes, blueprints, and maps, to the Japanese military. The other was an American POW held in the infamous Omori prison camp near Yokohama. This soldier had once been stationed near the Panama Canal, and when the Japanese discovered this, they subjected him to brutal beatings and intense interrogation, trying to extract every detail he could recall about the canal's defense systems. As the war dragged on and Japan continued to lose territory, there were fewer troops guarding the canal, making it seem like a vulnerable target. The ultimate goal was to strike at the Gatun Locks, a critical choke point in the Panama Canal system. Planning for this attack began on December 15, 1944. Just 15 days later, the 631st Naval Air Group was established with 30 experienced pilots. These men believed in completing missions and returning alive, rather than dying in suicide attacks. Their first training area was Toyama Bay in the Sea of Japan, where they practiced on a full-scale model of the locks. However, the training was marred by frequent accidents, delayed aircraft deliveries, and loss of life. American air and naval forces did not ease their pressure. On January 23, 1945, the 631st moved to the Kure Naval Yard. then relocated to Hiroshima in early February. During this time, Japan's innovative I-400 class submarines, capable of launching aircraft, were also preparing. The I-400 suffered slight damage during an air raid at Kure, but the I-401 and I-13 managed to escape to sea, while the I-14 was already out of range. Just days later, American B-29 bombers began scattering sea mines across the inland sea, turning the planned submarine routes into deadly traps. Crews from the 631st and Subdivision 1 were worn down by constant American bombardment and the looming sense of defeat. On March 26, 1945, Japanese Army Chief of Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu canceled the biological attack proposal, reasoning that the risk of retaliation from a militarily superior United States was far too great. By this time, the reality was sinking in. Germany was nearing defeat in Europe, and Japan's own situation was growing dire. Once the Allies secured Europe, they would shift their full attention to the Pacific. The Japanese knew that closing the Panama Canal was a strategic move that could buy them more time. Since conventional military routes across oceans depended on the canal, disrupting it would have major consequences for Allied logistics. The Japanese High Command ultimately supported the canal attack over risky biological warfare. Rather than using surface ships vulnerable to detection, they would launch aircraft from massive submarines designed specifically for the mission. The existence of the I-400 class submarines and Subdivision 1 was tied entirely to this goal. However, before any action could be taken, the Battle of Okinawa erupted on April 1, 1945. This was not just another island campaign. It felt like an attack on Japan itself. Subdivision 1 was stationed at Fukuyama near Hiroshima at this time, but fuel shortages severely limited their operations. To continue their mission, the I-400 was sent to retrieve fuel from Daren in Manchuria, returning on April 14th with 1,700 tons of oil. Meanwhile, the I-13 and I-14 headed to Korea for their share. The I-401, which was supposed to assist with the fuel transport, struck a sea mine while leaving port and had to return for repairs. Subdivision 1 was under the command of Captain Arizumi Tatsunosuke, who had a dark reputation. While commanding the I-8 submarine earlier in the war, he had ordered the execution of survivors from torpedoed ships. One of these crimes came to light after American forces rescued survivors from the Dutch ship SS Tiesalak. Despite his past, Arizumi was again placed in charge of a mission that mirrored Admiral Yamamoto's Pearl Harbor plan. The 4 submarines were stocked with 4 months of supplies, set to cross the northern Pacific undetected, bypass Hawaii, and then travel south along the coast of South America. Their plan was to launch 10 aircraft eastward across the Caribbean and northern Colombia, then turn back west to strike the Panama Canal. After completing their bombing run, the aircraft would fly northwest to rendezvous with their submarines. Pilots would ditch near their subs and be picked up for the journey back to Japan. If successful, the operation would buy Japan several additional months, possibly even years, of continued resistance. Initially, the mission was scheduled for late September 1945, but the tide of war was turning too quickly. Okinawa, the last stepping stone to Japan's home islands, was under full-scale American assault. Its geographic location made it clear that the next battles would take place on Japan's core territories. The Japanese leadership saw this and realized that time was rapidly running out. After 82 days of intense combat, the Americans declared victory on June 21, 1945, ending the Battle of Okinawa. Both sides turned their attention to the Ulithi Atoll in the Caroline Islands, a vital U.S. Navy base seized with little resistance in 1944. Though just under 2 square miles in land area, the atoll boasted a massive 210 square mile deep sea harbor. The United States had turned it into a key logistical hub, complete with a desalination plant, a general-purpose hospital, and a new airfield. Ulithi was important for one reason. It was the final staging point for an all-out assault on the Japanese homeland. Within its expansive waters floated hundreds of U.S. Navy ships, including over 20 aircraft carriers of various sizes and capabilities. From here, the final push against Japan would be launched. Despite all of Japan's desperate plans and secret missions, the overwhelming industrial and military might of the United States made the outcome of the war all but inevitable. The Japanese were determined to inflict heavy damage on the American fleet and facilities at Ulithi, attempting for the second time to achieve a decisive blow. Their original plan to strike the Panama Canal was postponed, and starting June 12, 1945, all training efforts were redirected toward preparing an attack on Ulithi. The Japanese High Command was unaware that their time was quickly running out. Submarines I-13 and I-14 replaced their powerful Siran torpedo bombers with the less formidable Nakajima C-6N-1 Sayun long-range reconnaissance aircraft. Upon returning to port, these aircraft were transferred to Truk Island. For Japan, Truk held the same strategic significance as Pearl Harbor, and Ulithi did for the Americans. Since Japan had taken control of Truk in 1919, they had been developing it into a deep water port in anticipation of a future war. The plan was to use the reconnaissance aircraft to gather intelligence, while the Sairans, disguised with American markings and flags to resemble American P-51 Mustangs from a distance, would carry out the actual attacks. These disguises were designed to mislead and confuse American observers. On July 11, 1945, the I-13 departed from Omato bound for Truk, carrying 2 Nakajima C-6Ns and 2 specially camouflaged Sayun scout planes. However, 5 days later, the I-13 was spotted by a Grumman TBF Avenger launched from the aircraft carrier USS Anzio. The destroyer escort USS Lawrence C. Taylor soon joined the hunt and successfully sank the I-13 on July 16th. Subsequently, submarines OI-400, I-401, and I-14 moved toward their designated rendezvous point in preparation for a synchronized attack on the Ulithi base. However, communication between them was disrupted due to a typhoon that lasted 2 days. During this time, an American tanker ship encountered the I-400, but was allowed to continue without any confrontation. When the I-14 reached Truk on August 4th, the Sayun planes were unloaded. Meanwhile, American ships and aircraft began harassing and chasing Subdivision 1. Captain Arizumi, leading the group, maintained contact with his remaining submarines using detailed charts and eventually decided on an attack date of August 25th. However, the situation drastically changed after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 8th. By August 14th, the I-401 arrived near Ulithi, possibly aware of the seismic shift in events. But the I-400 and I-14 had not yet arrived. The I-400 struggled to keep up with Arizumi's frequently changing plans and drifted off course. On August 14th, Emperor Hirohito issued a royal decree ordering all Japanese military forces, air, sea, and land, to cease all combat operations and submit to Allied forces for surrender. Subdivision 1 was instructed to display a black naval flag, symbolizing a vessel surrendering. On August 18th, all remaining submarines in Subdivision 1 were ordered to return to Japan as quickly as possible. They were told to avoid Allied ships, but if encountered, to follow their instructions without resistance. Despite the clear orders, many of the commanders and crew had difficulty accepting the reality that Japan had lost the war. There was distrust and confusion regarding the directives. Eventually, on August 26th, they set a return course at 12 knots. Before heading home, the submarines discarded all offensive equipment, Their aircraft were dismantled and sunk into the sea, while remaining explosives and Type 95 torpedoes were jettisoned into the water to ensure that the Americans would never uncover how close the Japanese had come to launching their operation. All documents, including maps, notebooks, and attack plans, were burned to destroy any evidence of their mission. The following day, on August 27th, Lieutenant Robert Mahoney, flying an Avenger torpedo bomber from the USS Bennington, became the first American pilot to spot a Japanese Sentoku submarine. He identified the I-401 and shortly afterward, the I-14. Despite the situation, the Japanese submarines made no attempt to flee and increase their speed. Mahoney signaled the I-401 to stop by making a pass over it and gesturing with a thumbs up, possibly hoping for some recognition or communication. The gesture might have been misunderstood or unrecognized as the sub continued undisturbed. Frustrated, Mahoney made another pass and this time made a more familiar gesture, a clenched fist shaken in the air. The I-401 finally slowed down. On August 29th, the American submarine SS Segundo closed in on the I-401. Meanwhile, destroyers USS Dashiell and USS Murray pursued the I-14. Commander Kusuo Shimizu of the I-14 eventually surrendered, allowing his submarine to be escorted back to port, though it was only 300 meters away. Later that evening, destroyers USS Blue and USS Mansfield encountered the I-400. While some crew members on board the massive submarine were merely observing the American warships in curiosity, the large gathering near the deck gun raised concerns. The Americans believed there might be hostile intent. They ordered the I-400 to halt completely, and the Japanese captain wisely complied. When Captain Arizumi returned to port, he was aware that his previous actions, including those tied to the Chichijima incident and the massacre of American POWs, would likely result in his arrest and prosecution for war crimes. Rather than face public disgrace and punishment, he chose to end his life. He retreated to his private cabin and shot himself on August 30th. His crew buried him at sea under the Japanese flag. American personnel began boarding the Japanese submarines soon after. Most Japanese officers, being graduates of their naval academy, spoke English well, so communication was not an issue. The American sailors appeared sharply dressed and clean-shaven, a stark contrast to the Japanese crew, who wore worn-out uniforms and bore the rugged appearance of men who had spent weeks at sea. By the time the submarines returned to Japan, the country was fully occupied by Allied forces. Once the Americans learned about the advanced capabilities of the IFR-400 series submarines, they were stunned. The 3 submarines were quietly taken to Hawaii under strict secrecy for further study. The U.S. Navy conducted an in-depth investigation into their engineering and technology. Although post-war agreements required that all discoveries from defeated enemies be shared with all Allied nations, including the Soviet Union, the United States had no intention of allowing the Soviets access to these powerful submarines. To prevent Soviet acquisition of this technology, the I-401 and the others were deliberately sunk after the U.S. had finished gathering all relevant information. The I-401 was destroyed by a Mark 10-3 torpedo off the northwest coast of Hawaii. The remaining submarines met the same fate, their secrets buried beneath the ocean. In March 2005, the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory rediscovered the wreck of the I-401 at a depth of over 2,600 feet. Even today, the true legacy and potential of the I-400 series submarines remain a subject of fascination and mystery. The story might have taken a different course had it not been for the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.